let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at a fascinating, high-stakes medical mystery today. Why do smart, highly trained people sometimes make genuinely dangerous choices? We usually think of hospitals as these hyper-secure places, right? Defined by strict safety protocols, endless checks and balances. But what actually happens when you inject the human element, specifically our hardwired psychological response to authority, into that rigid system? Well, today we're unpacking a landmark field study that completely shook the medical world and exposed a pretty glaring flaw in how we make decisions under pressure. But before we get into the hard data, I want you to ask yourself a simple, maybe slightly uncomfortable question. How would you react if an authority figure, like your boss or some huge expert in your field, pressured you to do something that went explicitly against protocol? Now, it is incredibly easy to sit back right now and say, oh, absolutely not, I'd refuse, I'd stand up for the rules. But as we're about to see, there is a massive gap between our hypothetical bravery and our actual behavior when the heat is on. To really grasp this, I want you to picture a bustling 1960s hospital ward. The atmosphere is just this chaotic mix of urgency and strict routine. Monitors beeping, stretchers flying past, and right in the middle of this intense environment, a junior nurse is suddenly ordered by a senior physician to give a patient a highly unusual drug dosage. An order that actually violates written hospital policy and pushes way past the maximum safe dosage listed right there on the bottle. She hesitates, right? Her training is screaming at her that this is wrong, but so are her ingrained instincts about never, ever questioning a doctor. This exact tension, that is what researchers decided to test out in the real world. Which brings us to our first section, the 1966 Hofling Experiment. So to understand what happens in these super tense moments, we've got to look at psychiatrist Charles K. Hofling. At the time, the world was still reeling from Stanley Milgram's famous laboratory obedience experiments, where everyday people administered electric shocks just because a guy in a lab coat told them to. But Hofling wanted to take this out of the artificial lab environment. He wanted to see what happens in a natural, professional setting where the stakes are literal life and death. So his team set this brilliant trap. They called 22 different nurses on evening shifts across multiple hospitals. An actor posing as an unfamiliar physician, Dr. Smith, calls the nurse's station and orders them to administer 20 milligrams of a fictional drug called Astroten to a specific patient. Now, here is the catch. The Astroten bottle, which researchers had secretly planted in the med cabinet, clearly stated a maximum dose of 10 milligrams. Plus, hospital policy strictly forbade taking any medication orders over the phone. So Dr. Smith was essentially asking these nurses to break multiple rules to administer a potentially lethal double overdose. And the results were, frankly, absolutely shocking. 21 out of the 22 nurses, that is a staggering 95% compliance rate, completely bypassed protocol. They grabbed the drug and actually moved to administer the dangerous overdose before being safely intercepted by researchers who were hiding nearby. Now, to be clear, the drug was just a harmless placebo, but the nurses had no idea. Only one single nurse outright refused the order on the phone. None of the complying nurses even sought verification from a supervisor, and they all moved to prep the drug within seconds of hanging up the phone. Just wild, right?
Let's move to Section 2, the power distance problem.
This brings us to the real core of this explainer. Why on earth would highly trained professionals ignore explicit safety rules just because a voice on the phone told them to? I mean, it wasn't because they lacked intelligence, and it definitely wasn't because they didn't care about the patient. In the post-experiment debriefings, all 22 nurses admitted they were completely aware of the dosage violation. They knew it was wrong, but they yielded anyway. And the answer lies in this concept called psychological power distance. Basically, this is the degree to which subordinates just accept an unequal distribution of power. Back in the 1960s, strict medical hierarchies conditioned nursing staff to completely, unquestionably defer to a doctor's perceived expertise over their own independent judgment. When you have this high power distance, a person essentially enters what psychologists call an agentic state. They view themselves just as an instrument for carrying out someone else's wishes. The doctor's authority literally short-circuited the nurse's own deliberative process. To use a really simple analogy here, these rigid hierarchical structures act a whole lot like high-speed manufacturing assembly lines. Think about it. On a factory floor, the line is moving incredibly fast to maximize efficiency, right? If a worker spots a potential defect, reaching up and stopping that entire proverbial assembly line to question an order feels almost impossible. It causes a massive disruption. Well, in the hospital, questioning the doctor meant halting the line. It meant risking insubordination and facing the potential wrath of a superior. So what did the nurses do? They defaulted to keeping the line moving, just hoping the manager knew best. Which leads perfectly into Section 3, Theory versus reality. The real twist in the Hofling experiment comes when we actually compare what people think they'll do with what they actually do under pressure. It's one thing to analyze that assembly line from the outside. It is a whole different ballgame to be the person standing right in front of the moving belt. This brilliantly illustrates the gap between theory and reality. See, before the actual field test, researchers gave a questionnaire to 33 other nurses, giving them the exact same hypothetical ascertained scenario. And get this, 31 out of 33 of them confidently predicted they would refuse the order. They cited patient safety, they cited hospital protocols, yet out in the actual field, 21 out of 22 complied. When you strip away that hypothetical detachment and insert the real-time pressure of an urgent phone call and an authoritative tone of voice, personal knowledge is just rendered inert. But hey, it's not all doom and gloom for human nature. A 1977 replication of this study by Rankin-Jacobson showed that if you change the environment, you actually change the behavior. They ran a similar test, but they used a familiar drug, Valium, instead of a made-up one. And, crucially, they allowed the nurses the opportunity to consult with their peers before taking action. Under those specific conditions, obedience to the bad order plummeted to just 18%. This is huge. It powerfully proves that familiarity with the risks and having a supportive, uplifting peer network are massive buffers against unchecked authority. Peer support is, quite literally, the antidote to toxic hierarchy. And that brings us to our final part, Section 4, Empowering Structured Disobedience. So, how did these striking revelations actually change modern healthcare for the better? Well, the medical community realized that while hierarchies are incredibly useful for getting things done quickly, especially in emergencies, uncalibrated obedience is a massive liability. Hospitals realized they needed a system similar to that manufacturing line's stop cord. Think of a car factory where any worker, regardless of their rank, is fully empowered to pull a literal cord to stop the entire production line if they spot a critical safety flaw. This is a brilliant concept known as structured disobedience. It deliberately shifts authority away from a rigid hierarchy and towards shared accountability. It officially gives that junior nurse the institutional backing to halt a procedure without the terrifying fear of being fired for insubordination. As a direct legacy of the Hofling experiment, nursing protocols were totally overhauled. Today, we have mandatory verification steps. Verbal orders, especially for non-emergency meds, are strictly regulated and absolutely must be verified. Nurses now undergo assertiveness training as a core part of their education, explicitly teaching them exactly how to challenge anomalous orders and consult supervisors. Basically, the medical field deliberately engineered a culture that demands second opinions. It acts as a structured, deliberate safeguard against our perfectly natural human instinct for blind deference to authority. So, the crucial takeaway here is that while authority can blind us, structured systems can absolutely save us. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought. Look beyond the hospital ward for a second and think about your own daily life. Authority gradients exist everywhere, right? In corporate offices, in schools, in the military. So ask yourself, in your workplace, is it safer to be right or to be obedient? And if you ever find yourself holding the proverbial stop cord, will you have the courage to pull it?